In this tutorial, we're going to make a simple appointment bookings application using a backend API and Angular with some material design components on the front end. Hi, this is James from Junior Developer Central and welcome to this full stack application tutorial. If you have a second before we start, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorial updates. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what we'll be building in this tutorial. As you can see, we've just got a simple form set up here and it's used to book appointments, just asking the user to enter a date and their name and email address. And there is also a second side to this application where there's a kind of administration panel that lists out all of the appointments that have already been booked in. So let's go ahead and create a booking, and using the material design components with Angular, we can just get a nice date picker where we can pick a particular date for our appointment. And then if we just enter a name and a test email address, when we click Make Appointment, you can see we've given a notification that the appointment's been booked and our form has been reset. And if we go to the list of appointments in our administration table, you can see we've got that appointment listed with all the details that we entered. And we've also got a button where we can cancel that to actually remove it from the table. And again, we get notification that that's successfully happened. So pretty simple. There is just one other thing where we're going to reject any duplicate appointments for the same day. So we're only really setting up one appointment per day. So if we try and book an appointment for exactly the same day, doesn't matter too much about the name and the email address, you can see we're given a notification that that's actually not possible to book an appointment on that date. So there's obviously lots of scope to improve this application, but the idea behind the tutorial really is just to get you used to a few backend CRUD operations, working with a few different HTTP verbs, and also getting used to using the material Angular components. So that's the quick demo over with. Let's go over to Visual Studio Code where we'll start coding this application up. So over in Visual Studio Code, we're going to start by setting up our project, and we'll just make two directories. The first one's going to hold our API, and the other one is going to hold the Angular app. And we'll go and set up the API first, and once that's up and running and tested, we'll start with the Angular app. So I'm just using the Express generator to set up our API, and we don't need anything too special for that, and I'll just install the dependencies so that we've got everything ready to go. So I only need to install a couple of extra dependencies for this tutorial. We're going to be using MongoDB to store our appointment data, and we'll also use the cause library just to make sure that our cross-origin requests are served between Angular and our API. Okay, so with that set up, let's just create a bit of config for the API which will hold some information about our database. So I'll create a config file, and module.exports is going to basically export some data that we can use through different parts of our app. So we'll need to know the database host, so we'll say localhost, and the DB name as well, database name in Mongo. We'll just call it appointments. Oops. And we'll also need a collection to store our documents inside of Mongo, so we'll create a DB collection property. Actually, let's just call the DB name appointments app. And that should be pretty much everything that we need. So we can move on now to configuring our app.js file to require our dependencies that we've just imported and also connect to MongoDB. So let's first of all import our config. And then also we need the Mongo client so that we can connect to the database. So MongoDB. And there's a property there just called Mongo client. And cause, we'll just import that as well so the app can use that. So let's actually create our Mongo connection, our connection to the MongoDB. So Mongo client.connect is the function we want to call. And the connection string will look a bit like this. So MongoDB, and then from our config we get the DB host. And there is a couple of options that we need to pass into there as well, just so that Mongo doesn't complain about some of the deprecations that have happened. So some old technology that's not used anymore. So these two properties here, we just set them to true. I guess they're in there for backwards compatibility. And once we've made the connection, we can then hook into the promise that's returned by MongoDB, and that will actually give us a client. And from that client, we can get a reference to the database itself, and we'll just get that information from our config file, so the DB name, and also the collection can then be accessed on top of that database. So config dot, and we need the DB collection. So with that set up, we've actually got a reference to our collection where we can run queries against our MongoDB. And we're going to save a reference to that in our app.locals set of variables. And we'll just configure that so that the name of that corresponds to the database collection that we've just retrieved. So we'll just assign it that collection variable. So that will get us connected to MongoDB and it will provide us with a collection. We'll set up some middleware here just so that we can make that collection easily available through all of our routes that we're going to be setting up. We'll move on to those in just a second. So the middleware basically will just retrieve the collection again from the app.locals, which is available on the request object. And it's config DB collection again. And then we'll assign that into the actual request itself, so we can just literally use request.collection to do our MongoDB queries. And let's move on to the next chain within the routing hierarchy. And we also want to make sure that we've got cores being used, so that'll prevent any errors when we're sending network requests. So that's pretty much all we need for our setup. It's nice and simple for this application. We're not doing anything too complicated with the actual configuration. So we can move now onto our routes for the application, which we'll just go into our index routing file and just delete what's there at the moment. So let's import, we're going to be using the object ID function from MongoDB as well. So MongoDB, and there's a property on there called object ID. And basically what we're going to be creating for our routes, we'll create 3 of them. We'll create a get route to get all of the appointments in the database. We'll set up a route for creating new appointments, which will be a post endpoint. And finally, when we click that cancel button in the admin panel, we want to trigger a delete endpoint, which in turn removes the data from the database. So the get one is pretty simple. We just need to say get, and we'll just say /appointments is the resource that we're retrieving. So within our callback, we've got a reference to the collection in our database, and we can just call the find function on there, which will find all of the records that are currently stored in the database, and we'll transform that to an array. And then with those results, we can literally just pass them back to wherever they've come from as JSON data, and then that can be used within the Angular application. We will actually just set up a catch here just in case there are any errors. And we'll just send an error back to the browser if that does occur. The next endpoint is a little bit trickier, but still not too difficult. We're just going to create an endpoint that responds to the post verb, and that will still be /appointments. So although it's actually still got the same name, it will not trigger at the same time because it will only respond when we send a post request. And this is going to create our new appointment. So we're going to be passing some data in the body here, and we'll pass 3 fields, the appointment date, a name, and an email. So if you were creating a more complex form that had more data, you could obviously specify that here, such as if you were going to add telephone numbers, etc., and you just extract that from the body of the request that's coming in. I will actually just do a quick if statement here just to check that all of those variables actually have some value stored in them. So if the appointment date is empty, or the name is empty, or the email has no content either, what I'll actually do, instead of carrying on, we'll return a status of 400, and that's quite important. I'll explain a little bit later on when we're working on the Angular app why that's important to configure like that. So 400 would just be a bad request, for example. And we're going to send some JSON data back with a message which will say the appointment date, name, and email are required. So that's just a message that will be displayed to the user if they don't supply all of the right data. But assuming we get past that if statement, we're going to construct a payload which we'll send to the database. And that's just going to be an object which is literally constructed of the properties that have been passed in already. So once we've constructed that object, we can then just insert it into the database using the insert1 function. I'll just say payload. And then we'll get the result from that, and we'll send res.json.result back to the browser. And of course, let's catch any errors, which for the moment we're just going to send back to the browser as an error, just like that. So that's handling the creation of new appointments. Let's create the endpoint that will handle removing endpoints, and that's going to be an endpoint that responds to the delete HTTP verb. And we'll do appointments again, but we do actually need to specify which appointment we're actually removing. So we'll pass as a path param the ID of the appointment that we want to delete. So that'll be the MongoDB ID that's in the database. So let's just set up our callback for that. So inside there, we'll first extract the path parameter. And that's just set as ID. And we need to convert that to a MongoDB object ID. So we'll just say object ID, use that function there, and just pass in the ID from the path. And then all we need to do on our collection is just to do a delete1 function. And we pass that the ID that we've just created. So we're only deleting that one document from the collection via its _ID. And then with the result, we'll just send that back. We probably won't do anything with that with Angular, but we'll send it back there just in case there's anything interesting to use. And of course, we'll catch any errors. Like so. So that's all three endpoints created. Before we actually go and start creating the Angular app, let's test the endpoints out with Postman to see if they're working okay. So let's start our application with NodeMon. Oh, and we did get an error there, so we must have had a typo or something. Let's have a look. There's a random L letter somewhere there, so app.js7. Oh, yep, I'll get rid of that. And hopefully when the app restarts, we've got no errors, no random characters hanging around. Oh, but there is some other warning here. Some of the problem, can't set a property if appointments of undefined. And that's on app 23, which is inside our connection, I think. Oh, so we've got app.local instead of app.local, so let's just check it in the middleware as well. Yeah, that's okay. So NodeMon's restarted and no further errors, so that's looking good. So we're going to head over to Postman and send some sample requests to test this out. So we'll start off by sending our GET request, and this should basically give us nothing at the moment as there's no documents already in there. So if we send a GET request to appointments, so we get a good response, but there's nothing in there, so there's no data in the collection at the moment. So let's try adding one in there. So this time we're going to local host, 3000, and then appointments again. And this time we're going to send some JSON data, because that's what Angular will send across. And what we'll actually do is we'll just send a blank object at the moment, and we should see we get the error message coming up in the response. If we scroll down, we can see that error message which we configured in the API saying we need to supply all of those required fields. So we know that validation is working. So let's just send an appointment date. I'll just say 24th of August, 2019. And we'll put my name in there as the data. And just a test email. So let's send that again, and we should get a good response, and it also should create the document in the collection too. So let's have a look. That's sent, and we've got the response. This is the response that MongoDB has sent back. So we can say that it's okay, and it's also created this new document. So now if we call the endpoint for get again, we should now have one document in there, which you can see returns an array with that one document with an ID generated for the appointment we've just created. So that all seems to be working pretty well. It would be good in our API, though we don't really want all this information from Mongo. We just would like to return potentially the data that's been created. We're probably not going to use it in our Angular app, but that's probably the preferred response when you create a new resource, to send the whole resource back to the browser or whatever's consuming the endpoint. So in our index.js file, instead of just returning the whole result, we'll return that ops property and the first item in the array. So we're only going to be creating one appointment at a time. So now if we just create another appointment, just say James2, test2 for example, if we send that, the response we get back from the post request is literally just the document from the collection that's just been inserted. So now if we should have 2 items in our collection, which is correct. And if we just grab the ID of the first one, if we send a delete command to the appointments endpoint, and the ID is going to be provided as a path parameter there. Now if we hit send, we don't need to worry too much about the body because that's not being used. If we look down, we've got a problem here saying that the object ID is not defined. So we might have a typo somewhere in our routing code here. Oh yeah, so that's all lowercase and that's not being used. So let's just make that uppercase. And in the delete endpoint, we're using an uppercase object ID. So back in Postman, let's just try that same request again. And we've got the result coming back saying that it's removed that one item from the collection. And we can confirm that by running the get request again, and that document has been removed. So that's the API setup. We've got a get point to get all of the documents in the collection, and we've also got a post endpoint to create a new appointment, and finally we've got the delete endpoint to remove it. So now that's set up and tested, let's go over to Visual Studio Code again and create the Angular application to consume the data from these endpoints. So back over in Visual Studio Code, let's close everything down that we had for the API because we know that's working, and close that folder. And we'll create a new terminal here, and we'll just navigate into the app folder, and we'll set up a new Angular app. We'll just call it appointments and install it into this directory. And we'll just accept the default things by accepting Angular routing using CSS for the style sheets. So once you've got Angular installed into your app folder, what we actually need to do is set up material design. There's a little bit more to do with this particular app. We need to do a bit more configuration, but luckily there's some schematics that Angular provides that make it quite easy to add material design into your project. And we just say ng add and then at Angular / material. And if we just let that run through and install all of the dependencies for material design, you actually get a few options when you're setting up. You can choose a theme. I'm just going to stick with the indigo pink theme, but obviously you can choose a different one if you're following this process. And also you can install Hammer.js for support, but we're probably not going to be using it for this particular application. And we also want the animations module installing as well. Okay, so that's installed the material design package for Angular into our project. Let's go ahead and actually configure the app module itself to use those dependencies and import Angular material components that we're going to be using for the project. So inside of our app folder, we'll go to the app module. And inside here, we're going to import a few different things. We're going to import the HTTP client module so that we can send HTTP requests. We're also going to import the forms module so that we can set up some of those form fields that we saw in the demo earlier on. And we're also going to import several of the material components. So we've got things in here like the table component, a spinner component, fields and buttons, and also the date picker itself. So once you've actually got those libraries imported, what we actually need to do is just tell them to be imported into the Angular app. So we'll import all of the material design stuff. Then we'll import the HTTP client module and also that forms module too. And we're going to need some components for our application. So I'm going to create 3 for this particular one. I'm going to create a component for the home page. So that's just what will actually contain the appointment component inside it. We'll also create another component for creating an appointment. So that's basically the actual form fields itself. And we'll create one more component, which is for the table for the appointment listing. And we're also going to need a service to actually send the HTTP requests, and we'll just create a service called appointments. So we're going to move on to creating the service first so that we can inject it into the different components so that we can send those HTTP requests. Let's actually just start Angular running in the background here. And before we actually go and create the service, let's go over to our environments files so that we can actually set an environment variable for our API location. So we'll say API URL is equal to localhost 3000, which is where our Express API is running. So with that set up, let's go to the appointment service. Actually, before we do that, let's create a model to store our data in, or to represent our data rather. So we'll create an interface called appointment, and if we export an interface of appointment, so this is basically mirroring the data that's in our MongoDB. So we've got an ID string, and also we need an appointment date, which is also a string. You might think it's a date, but it's actually stored in MongoDB as a string, then that's how it'll be returned. And we also had the appointment user's name and also their email. So with that data model set up, let's go and actually create the service now. So we'll first actually get a reference to the API, the base URL. So we'll just say base URL is equal to, and in our environment file, we've got the API URL. And what we actually need to do inside our constructor is inject the HTTP client. We need to get a reference to that as well. And then we can create our three functions, which will be used to get the appointments, create an appointment, and also cancel an appointment. So let's start with the first one, get appointments. And that's going to return an observable of which contains an array of appointments. So to get that data, we simply say return this HTTP get, and we need to type that in there. And we want to get a reference to the base URL, which is literally just localhost with a port of 3000, and then we want to access the appointments endpoint. It seems the appointment model hasn't been updated here. Let's just import that. And also it hasn't automatically imported in observables as well, so let's do that. So if we call this function, it will basically return the data from the MongoDB appointments collection, and we need to subscribe to that in our components, which we'll do in a moment. But let's set up the other functions. So we need one for creating an appointment. And if you remember, we made sure that that would just return the data that it's inserted, so the appointment. So that'd be fine to type it like that. And we want to actually, this time, we're going to be sending some data. So we're going to post to that endpoint. So the endpoint we are sending it to is simply the same again. So it's the base URL /appointments. But the difference with the post request is we actually need to send some data across to it. If you remember when we did in Postman, we actually needed to send the appointment date, name, and email. So we'll pass that into this function, and we'll just call it the same name. So appointment date is a string, the name is a string, and also the email is a string too. So when we're actually posting the data here, we pass it as the second argument to the post function, and we can just construct an object there. So we'll then say appointment date, name, and email again. And TypeScript's just complaining here about something, and it's because I've said we're returning an array of appointments rather than just a singular one. So there we go, that's our function to actually create a new appointment in the database. And the delete function is pretty simple, or the cancel function rather, so we'll say cancel an appointment. And we do actually need to know the ID of the appointment we're cancelling, and we don't really care too much about what data that returns because we won't do much with that. So we can just say observable any, and return this HTTP delete, and again we'll pass this .base URL, and it's /appointments, and we'll actually, using a template literal, put the ID as a path parameter in there. So that's the services set up. We're going to actually now route the components so we can start working on them. And we do that in the app routing module. And in the routes array that's set up, we're going to create the two routes that we're going to be using for the app. So for path, for the first one, we'll just send it to the home component. Oh, no, sorry, path and is blank, so that's just the root URL. And the component we're actually sending it to is the home component. And the second route we'll set up, again, the path, we'll set for appointment list. And the component for that will be the appointment list component. So whilst we're here, we'll just actually set the app.component.html file up as well. So this has got the placeholder Angular content in there at the moment. So let's remove that. And I'm going to set a div up with a class of container. And inside here, we'll just put a h1 tag, say appointment booking. And we'll also include the Angular router outlet in there. So those routes that we just set up will be actually loaded into this part of our application. And let's create the style for the CSS container class that I just created. So container, we're going to just make sure it's a reasonable width, but we want a bit of margin on it. So we'll set the margin, push it down on the page by 50 pixels, and the left and right, we're just going to get that auto so it's nicely centered in the page. So I think maybe we could start with our appointment list component so that we can actually view the appointments that we've already created. And don't forget we created some already with the postman calls that we did a moment ago. So in our listing component, we're going to create a few public variables to use in our template. So we'll say loading is equal to true. And we'll also set up a couple of messages to display when things go right or wrong. So we'll have an error message string, and we'll also have a success message, and that will be a string when it populates. And we'll also have in here a variable which will hold all of the appointments when they come back from the API. And so speaking of which, in our listing component initializes, we want to get all of the appointments in the database. So let's first of all inject the appointment service. Just create a variable for that. Appointment, oops, there it is, appointment service. And then once we have that, we can, in our ng-on-init function, we'll call the appointment service and get appointments. And we don't need to do too much else here. We just need to subscribe to get the result, which will be an array of appointments. And with those appointments, we just assign them to the appointments variable that we just created a moment ago. And for the loading, we'll just set that to false, just so we can hide the spinner when the subscription has finished. But we also want to listen out for any errors as well. So we might get some errors coming through here, and we want to handle those. And if we do get one, we'll say this dot error message is equal to error. And the HTTP error, which we're likely to get, has actually got another property inside there called error. So we need to say error.error message, and we'll also set loading to false here. And whilst we're in the listing component and still working here, let's actually create the cancel appointment button function. So when we click that cancel appointment button that we saw on the demo to start off with, we want to call this particular function, which we'll need the ID to actually send to the service. So in the appointment service, we want to call cancel appointment and pass it the ID. And although we don't want to do anything with the result that comes from the cancellation, we do actually want to reload the table data as well. So we're going to use a special RxJS operator here called merge map. We need to import that up here. Import merge map, and that is found in RxJS operators. And then back down here in our pipe, we just literally want to ignore the results. So this would normally have the result of our cancel appointment function call, but as I say, we don't really need to worry about what that's returning from the delete endpoint. But from the appointment service now, we can then call the get appointments function again, and that will be what we're subscribing to here. So we can literally do something similar to what we had in the init function. So this will have the array of updated appointments with the one that we've just deleted removed. And so inside there, we want to just update this dot appointments to equal that new value that's come back. And we'll also just put the success message here, just say that we successfully cancelled the appointment. But we will also put our error handling in here as always. So error event. And if there is a problem, we'll just set that to error.error.message as returned from the API. So with the actual component created, we can create the template for this now. And as you see, it's just got the placeholder in there at the moment. So we're going to import some of the material components that we inserted at the start of this part of the tutorial. And we're going to insert a mat spinner, but only if the loading property is true. And chances are we won't see this in local development because the HTTP calls are so quick, but we'll put it in there anyway just for completeness. And I'm actually going to use a component called map toolbar, which is actually more for showing a heading toolbar on your page, but we don't really have an Angular material component for just displaying alert messages. So this is kind of a bit of a compromise in that respect. So we're going to check if there is a success message being returned, and if there is, we'll just set the color to something slightly different there, and we'll just put that into the map toolbar that's created. And we'll actually copy that we've got a bit of a missing braces there, and just move that across. And we'll also just do this for error messages as well, as we defined in the component a moment ago, and we'll set that to a warning color as well. So now we can start working on our table of results, and we're going to be using a material table for this, but let's first just wrap that in a ngIf just while the component is loading, and also if we don't have any errors, because if there's some errors we don't want to display the data because we might get some problems with our templating here. And we're just going to create a table, and we assign it the directive of mat_table, and we set its data source equal to the appointments, which is the appointments being retrieved from the API. We'll also add a material class onto that to give it a bit of style. So mat elevation z8. And inside here we're going to use an ng container with mat column def to define the column name, which is appointment date. And inside that we can actually add our headings and data items. So we'll have a table heading of mat header cell. We also need to apply this particular directive as well, mat header cell definition. And we'll just say the appointment date. So this is kind of like the label for the column. And inside here we've got the actual cell which will contain the data, and mat cell definition is equal to an appointment. So this is looping through the appointment, so each time it loops this will get an individual appointment object. And so in here we can say the appointment dot appointment date is what we're showing here. Make sure I spell it correctly. So this is what we're using for each of the columns. So I'm just going to copy and paste this for the next one, and this one will be name, and just put name as the label. And finally in the data we're printing out, it's appointment.name, and then the other one here is going to be email, and email is the label, and we've got appointment.email. So there's one other column that we need to actually print out as well, and that was a column that had the cancel button in there. So we don't actually need to print out any data for this, but if we create a column definition called cancel, and we'll actually call the label cancel as well, and we've got a reference to the appointment object inside of here, but instead of just displaying that data inside, we want to create a button, and we'll set up a click event for that, and we'll link that to the cancel appointment function that we created in our component a moment ago, and we need to pass the appointment._id string to that so the API knows which one to remove from the collection. And so just finally, to finish this off, we'll add some material button styling to this with matte raised button, and we'll set the color to warned because it's a destructive action that we're doing here, and then we'll just put the text of cancel inside of the button. So that's the definition for our table, but we need to do a couple of things just to get it to actually populate on the page load. If we just go back to the appointment list component for a second, we're going to create another variable inside of there, another property, and we'll just call it columns. And we need to put all of the column names inside of an array here. So we've got appointment date, and we had name, email, and we also need to put that cancel column in there as well. So you can think of it just as a list of columns that we want to display on the table. So after that final ng container, we put a final row in there, and this is the mat header row property, and mat header row def is the directive, and we just set that to the columns variable that we've just created. And then finally there's one more row in here where we say mat row. So this is like the ng repeat showing all of the rows, and it has a mat row definition, and we equal that to apply the appointments data, and we also set a columns attribute of columns, which is again the public property that we just set a moment ago. So just before we go and view that, let's add some CSS to make the table fill most of the page, and we'll just set another margin top on there to push it down a bit, and we'll set the width to the 100% of the container, so that should spread most of the page for us. And if we go over to our browser, and if we hit localhost 4200, and the component name was routed to appointment-list, so let's load up that URL. And you can see a table being displayed with some of that data, although the appointment date seems to be missing. Let's see if we just spelt that correctly in the container templating. So appointment dot, oh yeah, we missed a T off in there, so let's save that. And if we go back to the page, when it reloads, yeah, we can see the date, and this is the record that we had saved in the API before. So whilst we're here, we could also test out the cancel button. So if we click cancel there, you can see the data has gone from the table. We've got our success message, and if we refresh the page again, we can definitely see that the item has been removed from the Mongo collection because it's no longer appearing in our table. So that's our listing component pretty much set up. So let's go and create the content for the form that will add appointments to our database. So we're going to start off by creating our properties for success messages, and that's a string, and also for an error message for a string. And finally, we've got an appointment date as well. Let's just set that public as well. And we've also, that will be a string as well in our form, and also public name, and finally public email. So these correspond to the form controls that we'll be setting up in a moment. And we want to inject the appointment service into here as well. Appointment service. And so we don't need to do anything in the initialization of this component, but we do need to set up a function that will be called when we click the submit button in the form to create a component. So first of all, we're going to reset any success or error messages which may be present on the page already. And then we're going to call the appointment service that we created, and there was a function on there called create appointment. And that will basically take the appointment date, email, and name as a string. So let's send that through here. So appointment date, this dot name, and also this dot email. So this will be blank at the initialization of the component, but you'll see how that gets updated when the forms are actually filled in. And I've misspelled email there. I'll just put an L onto the end of that. And once the result of that has been passed back to this component, we're going to actually get a result of a created appointment, and we'll just type that as appointment. And so what we can do inside of our subscription is, first of all, we know we've successfully submitted the form and everything's gone well at this point. So we'll say this dot appointment date is reset, and this dot name is reset, and this dot email is also reset as well. But we also want to display a success message. So first thing I'm going to do, because what you'll find is the dates that come back are in a kind of ISO format, which isn't very easy to read. So I'm going to create a new date from the result that comes back. So created appointment dot appointment date, and I'll set that to a date string. So just a little bit easier to read in our success message. And I'll say this dot success message is equal to an appointment booked successfully for, and then that appointment date variable that we just created a second ago. So let's set up our error handling to here. Error event. And all we need to do is just say the error message is equal to that error dot message again. Oops, there we go. So I'm actually just in our template going to paste in to start off with the error and success message toolbars as we had in the listing component. And then I'm just going to set up a div with a class of form container. So I'm going to adjust the style of that in just a second. And then we're going to, inside of that, have a form which, when we submit it, calls that create appointment function that we had just a second ago. And inside the form, we're going to have some map form fields, which in turn will have an input, which will have a name property. We're going to set them as material design input boxes, and we'll also set a placeholder for them. So this one's going to be for the name, and we'll set up the one for the email as well. And these need to correspond to the ng models that we created inside of our component a moment ago. So we'll say ng model is equal to, and we want that to be name again. And this one is going to be the ng model for email. Let's make sure we update these properties too here that we copied across. And then we need to put in our date picker as well at the top. So I'm going to paste in some code for that here, which basically has another input inside that, but there's some additional markup which will handle the date picker for us, some placeholder information, and a little icon to open up the calendar. So let's save that, and we'll just set up some styles before we actually view it in the browser. So that form container that we just created, we'll set some margin top on that again, and we'll also set the max width of that to 350 pixels, just so it doesn't span the entire page. The form itself, we're going to set the display property of that to flex, and we'll have everything in a column. So to actually show this appointment on the page, if we go to the home page at the moment, you'll see there's nothing there apart from the title. But you can see we've got the home component that's been loaded there. So what we're actually going to do in our home component, instead of having just the placeholder text there, we'll just load in the appointment component. So we just say app-appointment. So if we go back to the home page again, and that reloads, we can now see the form appearing, and we can put some dates in there, and also our date picker is being used for selecting options for that particular input. So the only thing left to do now really is just to put the submit button at the bottom. So we'll go back to the template one last time in appointment, And just at the bottom of the form, oops, we'll add a button, all lowercase, and it's a matte raised button just to give it some color and texture. And the color is primary, which will give us the kind of indigo color, and we'll just say make appointment. Okay, so going back to the page again, when it reloads, we've got our form and we can submit that to create a new appointment. So there's no validation on this to say if we've actually put in any valid data, and I've left that off purposefully so that the API handles that for us, although we should really put something on here to check whether they've actually entered the required information. But for example, if we click the make appointment button now, you can see this message is the one that we set up in the API. So that's being handled by Angular and being displayed in the correct matte toolbar when an error message occurs. So let's actually set up a new appointment and see it in the appointment list. So we'll say James and test@test.com. And if we create the appointment now, you can see we've got the success message and it comes back with a nicely formatted date of the 1st of August. And if we go to the appointment list, you can see we've got that appointment in there and we've got the cancel button to remove that, and we know that works because we tested that before. So there's two things left to do here, and the appointment list, you can see this is the data that's been sent from the date picker, or rather the input box that handles that, and you can see it's not very user friendly. It's good to have that sort of information in the database to have the complete timestamp so you can compare it and do operations with it. But for our user experience, we actually want to show a better date from that. But Angular's got some pipes that will help us to do that. So if we just quickly go back to the appointment list component, inside of the appointment date here, we can pass in a date pipe, and you feel free to use whatever format you're used to here, but I'm just going to go day, day, month, month, year, year, year. And now when the appointments list component reloads, you can see the date is formatted nicely, although that data is stored in the full context in the database. And the other thing we did in the example app is if we created an appointment on the same date, it gave us an error message saying that the appointment was already booked. You can't book for the same day. And we haven't actually set that up. We need to go over to our MongoDB to set up an index so that we only have unique dates being entered into the database. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm over here in Compass where I can administer the Mongo database, and you can see the document that created that we just set up a moment ago. If I go to indexes and create a new index and just say unique dates is the name of it, we want to set up the appointment date field, and we can just set that as ascending. But the index we create, if we say create a unique index and save that, that will stop any documents being entered with the same appointment date. And if we go back to our API, what we want to do is that will actually occur at this point here when we're posting to the appointments endpoint. And it'll be triggered in this catch block here because Mongo will actually register that as an error and throw it. So what we can do here, instead of sending the error back to the browser, if we send a status of 400, and that's quite important because it will trigger the error callback within the Angular components that we've set up. And we just send some JSON, and we just send a message of no appointments available on that date. And just need to make sure that's an object. So now when that index constraint is triggered, this catch block will kick in and it will send this message back to the Angular front end. So we can try that out by creating another appointment date for the 1st of August. So if we go 1st of August, and the date we enter it isn't too relevant there because this should fail. So as you can see, the error callback within this subscription, within the appointment post endpoint, is actually triggered, and the error message from the API is passed back and shown to the user on the front end. So that brings an end to our appointment booking system with Mongo and Angular and Material Design. I hope you found a few useful points to take away from this. Obviously there's lots of improvements that we could make in terms of the messages that are displayed to the user, the validation on the front end, and also obviously the appointments table, the list and the ability to cancel the appointments is not protected in any way. So we'd really need to create some kind of administration system and protect that root in the Angular front end so that an authorized user can only view those bookings and cancel them from this page. But that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next full stack tutorial.